We're in your United States history book in chapter 15. And this chapter we're going to go into the Civil War, or start our journey into the Civil War. Starting with, of course, the major issues of that time, which were slavery and secession. Abraham Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He took that from the Bible, Mark 3:25. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other thing." Abraham Lincoln. A house divided against itself. And that's what we call basically what happened in these years to come in 1860s with the Civil War. The North and the South were divided. This picture up there is a picture of the movie The North and the South, here with, of course, Patrick Swayze there. But anyway, the North was very industrialized. The South was very agriculturally. And each wanted to protect its own interests. In the North was the abolitionists. In the South was the reaction of abolition. Abolition be anti-slavery. Congressional debates of extending slavery into the land gained by the Mexican War would split the Union. So when the United States gained these territories, they had to debate on whether these territories or these new states would be slave states or free states. The Compromise of 1850 postponed this break for 10 years, but it would come. Bloodshed would happen. Problems of slavery. Why would slavery be a problem? Well, we know. For one thing, slavery is basically not a biblical thing, right? Slavery was a socioeconomic condition that hindered the South. It discouraged immigrants to seek employment in that area. Also, skilled tradesmen stayed away from the South, and very few skilled workers were in the South because one could not find jobs with reasonable pay in a society that was dominated by slave labor. This discouraged the industrial development of the South. So there were some problems, but the issue basically was a moral issue. Slavery created social classes. Well, in the South, we had the aristocrats, were the large plantation owners, and they were really only about 1/10 of 1% of the people. And then the middle class. Some were the townspeople, a few merchants and tradesmen, but the middle class was actually smaller in the South than it was in the North. Of course, then came the poor, which had little chance of advancement, education, or economic advancement. Also, there was even a lower class, and that would be the slaves. They were at the bottom of the socio-economic scale. No hope of advancement at all. You can see from this picture how degrading slavery would be. The demand for slaves was increasing too in the 19th century, and there were 4 million slaves in the South by then. In 1800, a slave was worth $400. In 1860, that price went up to $1,200 or $1,500. And you see the picture that when a slave would escape, they would put out a reward. This is a runaway slave, and it tells about Henry May. He was 5'6" or 8 inches high, rather chunky build, bushy head, and it describes actually how, and it goes on to say what he did. And I think some of these said, well, he was actually worked inside the house or he worked outside the house, and they tell all about him, and they say, if you find him, there's a $150 reward to bring him back. These types of rewards were posted all over for runaway slaves at that time. The early anti-slavery movement. Well, of course, we go back that slavery was a moral issue because it devalued human life. And most people agreed, both in the North and the South, that slavery needed to be abolished in the future. But they knew it had to be done gradually. In fact, our first president of the United States, President George Washington, said we need to do this abolition of slavery by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. So degrees. So basically, George Washington was saying that we had to do this very slowly. Doing it drastically was definitely going to separate the United States, separate the Union and divide the states up. Anti-slavery societies formed, even some included slave owners. So, which is really, this is the early years of our government in the early 1800s. So even people that owned slaves knew that it was wrong. In some way, they too were anti-slavery and wanted to gradually come out of the issue of slavery, even slave owners back then. But early in the 1800s, many Southerners favored a gradual abolishment of slavery. And because, why did they do this? Because they saw no economic feasible way of doing this. Like, how can we basically let all our slaves go and still survive, since they made a lot of the money, especially in the cotton fields? They thought, who are we going to get to work in the cotton fields? So slavery was a big economic issue, especially on the Southern plantations. Here we have George Washington's picture. The time is near at hand which must determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves. George Washington knew it would be an issue. In fact, George Washington set his slaves free. We see it before he died. And basically his slaves were his friend. One of his slaves was his closest friend and did not want to leave George Washington. But anyway. And then we have Thomas Jefferson, who too we know owned slaves. He says the whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitted despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. Even Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves, knew it was wrong. If you study Thomas Jefferson's life, after his wife died, and he became president, he was not married, but her half-sister, who was half black, became his so-called common law wife. In fact, it is even said that Thomas Jefferson secretly married her. And because she was black, he was very secret about it, and he actually had children. So was he really owning slaves, or was this his family? And then of course we have Liberia in Africa. So you see in Africa here, here's where Africa, the country of Africa, here's where Liberia is. You can see here Liberia, and the capital being Monrovia. So why do you think it called it Monrovia? Because of President Monroe, who actually was instrumental in setting up Liberia. Well, what about Liberia? Well, the American Colonization of Society founded it in 1860 under President Monroe. Why did they found this country? Take this country? Because they knew that they needed a place when they freed the slaves. If the slaves decided to go back to Africa, they would be able to go back to a safe harbor, right? In Africa. So they established this independent nation of Liberia in Africa, set up for freed Black American slaves. And by 1860, 1,100 freed slaves had come to Liberia, along with missionaries and along with Black missionaries that came. And we studied that in the past chapters, how they actually set up missions there. So in Liberia, we did have it. 1,100 free slaves is not that many compared to 4 million slaves in America. And many of the slaves did not want to go back to Africa, were fearful of doing that. So, while Liberia was not the best, and another thing about Liberia, it was a colony, and so it would be controlled by the colony of America too. So it was not free in itself. Now we have the abolitionists. Well, one of the greatest abolitionists. Okay, what is an abolitionist? They were very anti-slavery and very boisterous about it. Now, some were moderate, that they just knew slavery was wrong, and others would stand up and say, we have to do this now, and they'd fight against slavery in any way that they could. So we have Garrison, and he was very much an outspoken abolitionist. In 1830s, the abolition movement made a radical turn, they demanded that slavery be abolished immediately. Not gradually like President Washington and President Jefferson had thought of doing, but immediately. Well, William Lloyd Garrison, of course, he lived 1805 to 1879. He was a very fiery preacher, New Englander. And he, of course, demanded the immediate, unconditional freeing of slaves everywhere. In his writings, his writings were so dogmatic and so charismatic writings that they were used to stir up hatred by some peoples and discontent. So people would take his writings and say, hey, look what Garrison says. And then they would get around and make people very angry and wanting to fight on this subject. And so in 1830, he condemned the federal government. And he also condemned the United States Constitution for supporting slavery. And so he wanted to basically start a new government, and he advocated that the North succeed from the slaveholding South. So what he wanted was the North to succeed from the Union instead of the South, which we find later on would succeed from the Union. But he advocated that we need to get rid of these slave-holding South, and we need to start our own country, and we need to take this Constitution and make sure that it's changed to the point so that there's no way that we could support any parts of the issue of slavery. And so this secession meeting for the North to withdraw from the Union, I bet you guys didn't know about that, met in Massachusetts. And more moderate abolitionists that were against slavery were shocked by Garrison's demands that he wanted to divide the country and withdraw from the Union. But he drew many abolitionists to violence because they thought, okay, we're going to have to fight, so let's get going. Let's fight on this subject. And when violence comes as a major way of doing it, you're always going to have problems, aren't you? In the South, the abolitionists gained many enemies, and in the South before this time, there were many in the early times of America in the early 1800s. There were many people in the South that were against slavery, and many people in the South did not have or own slaves. So in the beginning, the South looked at possibly that the slavery would have to be abolished, but they just didn't know how to do it. But now, when they were listening to Garrison that he wanted to kill them and wanted to kill everybody in the South, that the abolitionists gained many enemies, and people in the South were angry about what was going on in the North, and basically the North wanting to get rid of them. Here's some pictures here. This is Garrison. It says, enslave the liberty of one human being and the liberties of the world are put in peril. I do think that's a good saying. Each individual is important, he's saying. And then he said, I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Here we see his wife there and him in that picture. The Liberator. He wrote a newspaper. He was a newspaper writer and owner, and the newspaper was called The Liberator. And he said, on this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I am in earnest. Kind of like what I read that before in that last slide. He said, I will not excuse, I will not retreat, and I will be heard again. And here's the picture of the Liberator newspaper. Then on we had the Nat Turner Revolt in 1831. This was the largest slave uprising in the history of the South. So just think Nat Turner, he was a Virginia slave. He lived 1800 to 1831. And he stirred up a rebellion. And in this rebellion, 55 white individuals were killed, mercilessly killed. That means they just went ahead and killed them. And some of them were practically innocent. And most of his victims were women and children. So Nat Turner was not the greatest of abolitionists. Basically, in the Southerners then, they saw this slave uprising with Nat Turner, and they blamed, but who? Of course, they blamed Garrison and the abolitionists as stirring up this slave revolt, which they didn't, but they were blamed. And some slave owners took revenge on innocent Black Americans, and on their slaves because of what had happened on the Nat Turner Revolt. The Liberty Party. Well, the Liberty Party was supported by a guy named James Birney. And he was a former slave owner. He had basically set his slaves free. And he ran for presidency between 1840 to 1844, but of course he lost. But the moderate abolitionists supported Birney over Garrison, of course. Supported Birney's beliefs because he was a moderate. He basically wanted to get rid of the whole institution of slavery, but in a moderate way. And he was very loyal to the Constitution, not like Garrison. He didn't want to get rid of the Constitution, and he didn't want to advocate secession from the Union, those kind of things. So mainly most of the moderate abolitionists and most of the people in the North would support the Liberty Party rather than Garrison's ideas. So here we have the Liberty Party election 1840. They won 7,000 votes. That's not a whole lot out of 2.5 million. And it was a one-issue party. The policy was to denationalization of DC and military locations in high seas and territories, and anti-discrimination or anti-slavery. Okay, that's the Liberty Party. That's John P. Hale there, but actually the founder would be James Birney. Okay, onto the Underground Railroad. We probably heard this, especially if you have seen the movie Harriet Tubman. It's really a good movie. I think everyone should watch it. So the Underground Railroad fought slavery directly. They had a network of escape routes and hiding places for slaves to become free. And they called these hiding places stations. And these fugitives would be helped to escape to the North or to Canada from the South. Harriet Tubman, and she lived 1820 to 1913, she was an escaped slave from Maryland herself. And so her heart was to help many of these slaves, and many of the slaves that she helped were being abused. And so during the 1850s, helped 70 slaves to escape to freedom. So we have a picture of Harriet Tubman in the Underground Railroad. The growth of the abolition movement. Well, the abolition movement gained strength, of course, in the North. In the North, they didn't own slaves. But as the North became more critical of slavery, especially with some of the dynamic abolitionists and outspoken and even advocating violence to the South, the South became very defensive, thinking, even if they didn't support slavery, or if they did support slavery, they were angry at the way they were treated by the abolition movement in the North. Here we have some famous abolitionists. You can go back in history and research some of these. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there, and then we're going to go to the compromise that postpones the war. But as you can see, the big issue in the future and the big issue coming up to fight about in the war, the Civil War, how this would divide a country. And that's what we're going to see that happen. The sad thing that it happened is that it could have been prevented in some ways, but slavery needed to be totally abolished.